had, according to Islamic belief, soiled family honor. European authorities were so much the prisoners of multiculturalism that they could actually believe that their obligation in such matters was not to protect innocent children from brutality, but to display sensitivity to cultural difference. Within Europe's Muslim communities, only a very few unimaginably bold men and women dared to speak out against the traditional Sharia-based autocracy of the mullahs and imams. And when they did so, they were not defended, let alone praised for it by the government or media or professors, but were rather accused of betraying their people and rocking the boat. Take the writer Walid al-Qubaisi, who came to Norway from Iraq many years ago, and who has recounted a conversation he had with the ethnic Norwegian director of what al-Qubaisi described as an international cultural center. This cultural bureaucrat plainly thought of himself as being devoted, heart and soul, to the welfare of immigrants. Yet when al-Qubaisi raised the question of the freedom of Muslims to criticize or even leave their own religion, the cultural bureaucrat was displeased. "You are a Muslim, Walid," he said, "and you must not lose your identity." "But do you believe," Walid asked, that I will lose my identity if I believe in freedom of expression?" "Listen," the man replied, "this is something you decide for yourself, but your attitude causes a lot of problems. We want to create a multicultural society, and we don't want to dissolve these foreign cultures. Your attitude alters all our plans. It creates conflicts between immigrants." So it goes. While Western Europe's multicultural mentality views native Westerners as individuals who have an inalienable right to self-determination, it views Muslim immigrants as members of a group with its own collective self-definition, and while those within the group who labor to reinforce and to enforce that self-definition are rewarded, those who try to live as individuals in ways that are inconsistent with the community orthodoxy are seen as making problems, as creating conflicts. For the only legitimate identity that they have in the eyes of European multiculturalists is a collective identity, an identity yoked entirely and irrevocably to skin color, ethnicity, and religious background. If ethnic Europeans may choose to belong to any religion or none, but are expected to respect the law, Muslims, as Walid al-Qubaisi has pointed out, are seen as, quote, religious beings by nature, and therefore as people who cannot be expected to conform to European law and culture, but who cannot be blamed for adhering to even the most inhuman of Quranic precepts. It is precisely this kind of thinking, this kind of multicultural thinking, that has led judges across Europe to give perpetrators of honor killings not heavier sentences because their crimes are premeditated, but lighter sentences because their crimes in the eyes of the perpetrators' native cultures are not crimes at all. Norway's most famous lawyer has even argued that the punishment for honor killing should officially be set lower than that for other murders, his argument being that when a man has acted in accordance with his own culture's values, it is wrong, indeed arrogant, for us to consult our culture's values when determining his sentence. In short, instead of expecting the Muslim perpetrator to conform to our society's norms, we should be striving humbly and respectfully to understand his society's norms. With few exceptions, the Western European establishment's entire approach to Islam is shaped by this perverse kind of thinking. In Britain, the Queen has knighted Salman Rushdie, but she's also knighted a man who called for Salman Rushdie's death. Ken Livingstone, when he was mayor of London, not only played host to and touted the progressive credentials of Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who supports suicide bombing and the execution of gay people, but he also smeared the reputations of gay activists who criticized him for doing so. In the Netherlands, Amsterdam Mayor Job Cohen has called for, quote, accommodation with Orthodox Muslims, by which he means Orthodox Muslim men, quote, who consciously discriminate against their women, yes, their women, quote unquote, and the acceptance of, quote, opinions and habits on the part of these Muslims even if we do not share them or even approve of them, close quote. Cohen did not make it clear where he would draw the line, at forced marriage, at wife beating, at honor killing. I want to call special attention here to the apparent ease with which a supposed liberal, such as Cohen, is able to fall into the practice of rendering Muslim women invisible by using Muslims as a synonym for Muslim men and referring to women as if they were indeed those men's property. In recent years, Western European citizens have been hauled into court, or will soon be, for writing books, for making films, or for just saying things about Islam that were less than laudatory. There has been one ominous development after another in the West, whose significance to our freedoms many of us have failed to appreciate. The Archbishop of Canterbury has embraced the inevitability of Sharia law in the land of Magna Carta. That same country has denied a Dutch MP, Geert Wilders, entry because of things he said and written about Islam, thereby confirming Wilders' own argument about the readiness of European governments to placate Islamists by silencing their critics. A couple of years ago, the then Dutch Minister of Justice said that if 2/3 of Dutch voters wanted to introduce Sharia law in the Netherlands, he would have to accept it because, as he put it, it would be a disgrace to say this is not permitted. And leading European intellectuals have equated Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was born in Somalia, ran away to the Netherlands from a planned forced marriage in Canada, and ended up a member of the Dutch Parliament, has equated her with the Islamic thugs who threaten her life. These intellectuals argue that if Ayaan Hirsi Ali, if her opponents are Islamic fundamentalists, then Hirsi Ali, because she stands up unequivocally and uncompromisingly for liberty, is an Enlightenment fundamentalist, as they put it. In their view, what's desirable is to be what they consider moderate, flexible, accommodating. In other words, to be willing to sacrifice freedom on the altar of multicultural harmony. And to make this sacrifice, we're repeatedly told, is only reasonable. Indeed, a couple of years ago, when a coalition of Dutch politicians, educators, business leaders, and Christian and Muslim clergy announced their intention to try to exclude Geert Wilders from public debate because of his criticism of Islam, they actually described themselves as reasonable people, quote unquote. It was interesting to note that when the so-called Muslim intellectual Tariq Ramadan, who among much else has refused to condemn the stoning of adulteresses, was appointed to a chair at a major Dutch university, none of these reasonable people said a word against it. This was no surprise because it has long since become clear that as far as Europe's reasonable people are concerned, Orthodox Muslims who are openly and actively working to achieve the full Islamization of the West are to be invited into the tent, just as long as they claim to reject attaining this goal through violence. I'm speaking of people like Mohammed Usman Rana, who has been welcomed into the pages of Aftenposten, Norway's newspaper of record, as a regular columnist, even though he has categorically refused to reject the death penalty for homosexuals. Meanwhile, those who criticize people like Rana routinely find themselves being harassed, insulted, misrepresented, and demonized in the same media organs that welcome the views of men like Rana. I live, as I've said, in Norway, which is a small country of 4.5 million people. But precisely because it is so small, it serves as a useful microcosm of what's going on in Western Europe. I have quoted this before, but I'll quote it again because it's so disturbingly typical of the attitude I'm talking about. Back in 2001, confronted with the fact that 65% of rapes in Norway were committed by quote-unquote non-Western immigrants, which is the Norwegian euphemism of choice for Muslims, Uni Vikan, one of Norway's leading Islam experts, said that, quote, Norwegian women must take their share of responsibility for these rapes because Muslim men found their manner of dress provocative. Norwegian women, she maintained, and this is a quote, must realize that we live in a multicultural society and adapt to it. Then there's novelist Dag Solstad, who was a major literary figure in Norway, and who last year, in a highly publicized